minutes. So please take your seats and prepare for a great first session of the day. Thank you.
Amy, can you hear me?
Hi, everyone. We'll be starting in about 2 minutes. Please get your seats. Be ready to listen. The case for investing in impacted communities and grassroots justice. Please have a seat.
Hi. Great to see you all. My name's Maggie. I head up the UK government's International Forests Unit, and I am very much the least important person on this panel, so that's all I'm going to say. In terms of the running of the session, I'm going to very quickly introduce each of our panelists. We have 3 on stage, and my first hybrid event at COP, 1 on screen. I have 3 or 4 questions that I'm going to ask the same question to each of our panelists. If they're very well behaved and they give you nice, succinct answers, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And with that, I shall kick off. So our esteemed panel, first on my right, stepping in very last minute, so a particularly big thank you, is Sonkita, who's from Nmati in Sierra Leone, discussing their legal commitment by the government to provide legal and technical support to communities for land consultations. Second, we have Effort from the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, showing about how empowered communities can stop harm at the source. The furthest in the room from me, Gianella from DAR, showing how investments in indigenous communities has improved outcomes for environmental transition, building resilience and mitigation opportunities. Gianella will be supported by Erica, who stepped in very last minute to do some translation on our behalf. So Gianella will switch between herself and Erica, who can project into the room in English. And then finally, and of course not least, on screen, we have Amy from the Legal Empowerment Fund, sharing how funding legal empowerment can shift community participation in adaptation and mitigation challenges. So, somewhere in here I have my questions. Here we go, page 2. So for the first round of questions, and we only have 1 microphone in the room, so excuse us as we pass it down the row. What type of investment support do you see grassroots communities needing, and how does that relate to climate change?
Thank you, Peggy. It's great to be here. So several years ago, a community leased over 40,000 hectares of land to a mining company. Now, basically what happened was the company showed up with the lease already drawn up, and they came in with a bag full of cash, went into the community and got them to thumbprint the agreement, and they paid over the first year's rent. Now, what the communities did not know was that the terms in those agreements that they signed were adverse to their well-being and to their livelihoods. But no one was there to tell them. No one looked at the agreement. No one was able to interpret in their language what was in the agreement. And no one was able to project their opinions and their voices into the agreement. That story is not unique in Sierra Leone. It is something that happens regularly. And Nmati in Sierra Leone has been working with communities to prevent that from happening, making sure that before communities put their thumbprint on a piece of paper, they know exactly what is in it, and they have channeled their thoughts into it as well. Now, how does that happen? Who makes it happen? The government doesn't make it happen. The companies don't make it happen. Sometimes they tell you, okay, we will pay a lawyer who would act on behalf of the communities. But you know, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so what happens at the end of the day is that the companies get what they want. And what we've been doing is ensuring that communities have access to legal and technical services when they have to interact with companies. And one way that could be done is by setting up a justice fund whereby communities could access a lawyer of their choice or a professional of their choice when they are faced with those kinds of situations. Unfortunately, we made an attempt in the last year and a half to get that provision built into a new law that has been passed in Sierra Leone, which is very progressive, by the way, and I'll talk about that in a couple of days here. But the Justice Fund provision did not make it in there because the government felt that, it would be an additional burden on companies. But that was not the case. It was never going to be an additional burden on companies, but somehow it didn't make it in there, although it's in a land policy that the government passed in 2015. But communities do need this kind of support. Not only currently, but even when we are moving into a transition phase, they need to know what kinds of projects that they would say no to or yes to, and they need to be supported to be able to project what they'd like to see in those agreements and in those partnerships. So I would say, Peggy, one of the first things that these communities would need in terms of investments is investments that help them attain justice in their interactions with traditional companies or with transition arrangements that will be coming into play in the coming years.
Thanks, Sankita, for also taking some of my points. I think in addition what Sankita has highlighted, I would like to add that with communities, especially the ones that we've been working with, we have noticed that there is always a knowledge gap that exists between the, for lack of a better word, let me say the higher offices and the grassroots. We have these conferences where we talk of mitigation, adaptation, absorptive capacity, everything we discuss at these high level conferences. But when you go down to the communities, the grassroots, these are some of the things that they are not aware of. A few weeks back, we had gone to one of the communities in Zimbabwe, in Gwanda, where we were trying to understand how much they know when it comes to climate change, what's their understanding, the issues, and the steps that they can take to mitigate. That whilst we're doing a training, we would understand that most of them, this was foreign, the majority of them. It was foreign to them because for them it was day to day. Today it's the sun is too hot, tomorrow it's like this, the rain is just delayed. But they never took to understand that there could be need for them to mitigate. So when it comes to communities, I very much understand that there is need to capacitate their knowledge. That is massive knowledge capacitation of grassroots communities. But then in addition to that, you notice that when it comes to issues of climate change, it also comes with investments, companies coming into the communities. For a while now, as an organization, what we have been trying to advocate for is for free, prior and informed consent on the part of communities. We need them to take part when these agreements are being made between the states and the companies so that they're able to voice out their concerns, highlight issues, and also be able to air out and understand how much the companies are able to mitigate on issues of climate change. So those are the most that I can say there's need for communities, especially in the grassroots, from my own point.
Thank you. Reciba un cordial saludo de Derecho, Ambiente y Recursos Naturales de Perú. Y bueno, respondiendo a la pregunta y dando un poco de contexto y además añadiendo a lo que mis compañeros ya dijeron, nosotros desde las experiencias que tenemos como ONG que trabajamos con pueblos indígenas, queremos principalmente que las comunidades tengan seguridad jurídica, que sean dueños de sus tierras y para que de tal manera ellos puedan seguir desarrollándose y que no los sigan agrediendo también quienes realizan actividades ilegales y una serie de proyectos. Le paso para que pueda traducir.
So greetings from environment and natural resource, the rights to environment and natural resources in Peru. Adding to what my colleagues have said and to give you a little context, our work is with indigenous communities in Peru. We focus very much on land rights and securing land rights for communities, especially when companies come in, but also in terms of climate change projects.
además de la seguridad jurídica que va a permitir, para nosotros es el primer paso, la seguridad jurídica. Luego es muy importante que los fondos que se puedan dar para financiamiento climático se mejore la gobernanza, los procesos de transparencia en estos fondos y que no sea un proceso opaco y además que la burocracia, o sea, tenemos que luchar contra la burocracia para que de esta manera sean las comunidades las que puedan recibir los mayores beneficios y eso no solamente se quede a nivel de las grandes ONGs o solamente en proyectos, sino que llegue a territorio. Eso es lo que queremos que se promueva, mejorar la gobernanza, la transparencia y disminuir la burocracia.
So the struggle of her community and her organization is to make sure, to help, that when climate change projects come into the community, that they're not opaque, that there isn't so much bureaucracy that the communities don't know what's happening and that they can't actually get real benefits. One of the primary methods that they use to do this is to make sure or to struggle for land rights to territory for indigenous peoples. And to make sure that there is oversight of the implementation of these projects. Often the projects, as we all know, are very opaque. There's a lot of bureaucracy. It makes it very difficult for communities to access the funds and to know what's going on, and for the communities to get real benefits from the projects. So first step, real priority, land rights to indigenous territories. Second step, making sure that there's more transparency in these projects, good governance of the projects as they're implemented, so that the communities actually reap the benefits of these projects.
Y finalmente, que la implementación de los proyectos sobre financiamiento climático no solamente sean una lista de tareas que se hagan check y ya, ¿no? Sino que de verdad se evalúen los resultados para que las comunidades, para que estos talleres, las capacitaciones y todo lo que se realice en comunidades tenga un proceso de evaluación efectivo. No es solamente hacer un proyecto y checklist y ya está. O sea, es necesario que se puedan evaluar resultados. De esta manera, las comunidades puedan mejorar su adaptación ante el cambio climático y sigan trabajando en fortalecerse internamente para resistir todo este proceso que ya se está dando. Eso sería todo.
So also they work to make sure that climate change projects are implemented in a transparent manner and a manner that actually brings the benefits of the projects down to the communities. We all know that often these projects have checklists that the donors want to fulfill, and that there are lots of consultancies that are involved, but that doesn't always mean that there are real results for the communities. So she and her organization are advocating for real results, for an evaluation and monitoring process that makes sure that these monies are spent wisely and actually benefit the communities so that they can improve their adaptation responses and that their various strategies to work on climate change, whether it is to slow deforestation or a variety of other things, to make sure that the benefits reach the communities.
Good morning. So I'm Amy. I work for the Legal Empowerment Fund, so I'll call it the LEF for short. We're hosted at the Fund for Global Human Rights. In this organization, we have over 20 years of experience making grants to grassroots human rights groups really across the world. And the LEF was launched in September of last year, and we made our first grants in July of this year, providing about $2 million to grassroots groups as unrestricted operating support. So we fund groups that use legal empowerment, which we feel is a very important tool for communities in the fight against climate change. So they use the law and legal systems to deal with disputes and grievances, to protect their rights, to hold authorities, individuals, and private companies to account, and to bring about legal and systemic change. So I'm here to make the case that grassroots groups need funding. When the LEF launched their first open call and with no thematic geographic restrictions, and we received inquiries from about 4,800 organizations and applications for 3,500. And while these groups addressed a number of issues, environmental justice and climate justice was one of the top issues that they were addressing. And unfortunately, the LEF cannot even fund all the groups that are doing great work. So the other thing, other than money, of course, is that we want climate justice to be people-centered. And that means that community groups must be part of the conversations about climate justice and be able to meaningfully participate in adaptation and mitigation efforts. One of our grantees is Siembra in Colombia, and they have done work to protect the Atrato River in Choco, which is a department in Western Colombia. So in 2017, the Constitutional Court ruled that the Atrato River has its own rights for protection, conservation, maintenance, and in this case, restoration. And this was a great victory for the indigenous peoples in the Chaco region who, relied on the river's ecosystem for food and livelihoods. But we all know that a court ruling does not automatically change the situation. And so what Siembra did is they worked with community groups first to just communicate the details of the legal ruling to the communities. So, sometimes the language used is very technical by the courts, and you need a law degree to interpret that. So that's the first thing they did, was communicate the ruling and what it said. And then they participated in the commission of the River Guardians. And what this ruling said is that individuals from government, from advisory organizations, and from communities would serve as river guardians to ensure that the river's rights were protected. And we see this as a great victory because the community individuals, representatives from the community, were actually able to participate meaningfully in the protection of their local resources. And we're happy that Siembra recently celebrated the 5-year anniversary of the ruling and the landmark recognition of the rights of the river itself. So happy to highlight that group and make the case for funding and meaningful participation by communities.
Thank you to all of our panelists for their their answers to question 1. I'm going to switch the order. Well, do you know what? I'm going to keep the same order, but I'm going to kick off with effort for the next one, giving them the opportunity to steal each other's points in turn. I know the type of investment support is often addressing the barriers, so you will have touched on some of this in your first answers. But what do you see as the barriers to the type of investment that you've been highlighting for communities? Effort, over to you.
Thank you. Now the opportunity that you have been given to take all the points, you realize you don't say everything. Maybe from practice or where we have been so far, I would say the number one barrier goes back to funding opportunities that actually address or that make it possible for organizations to reach out to all the communities. I'm trying to recall the number of communities where we have been able to reach out to in Zimbabwe, but all I can say is it's a fraction. We have the potential to do more. It's still a fraction of what we can do. As I was highlighting that we had gone to Gwanda. Gwanda has more than 23 wards, but on that particular visit, we only managed to visit about 4. So that's 4 out of 23. I'm just giving an example of Gwanda, not other districts as well. So it's always the number one issue. But second to that, the barrier that we have seen when it comes to reaching out to communities has always been a political barrier where we have misinterpretation of intentions when you're reaching out to these communities as organizations. You have, let me use the term, gatekeepers. They want to know what you want to do. They are concerned about the knowledge that you are imparting on people. And usually the concern comes from once the communities have been empowered, they're in a position to demand accountability, they're in a position to demand service delivery. And because of that, they want to gatekeep so that at least to a certain extent they control the amount of information that you give. And only maybe linked to that, you realize that when I highlighted the issue of knowledge capacitation, in that knowledge capacitation, you teach communities on mitigation. And when you teach communities on mitigation, it means now they have to take up certain projects that are resilient-based and they're actually focusing on trying to sustain their livelihoods. When it comes to those projects, now it goes back to the local authorities. Some would want to have a stake in those projects to the extent that the beneficiaries end up being politically aligned to people that are controlling the politics of that particular area. So those two, funding and political intervention, for me, they are the most barriers when it comes to these empowerment or investment opportunities that can be available to communities.
Gracias. Bueno, una de las principales barreras consideraríamos que es la falta de voluntad política para la implementación muchas veces de las demandas que tienen las comunidades. En el caso de Perú, por ejemplo, las comunidades han tenido que luchar mucho de la mano con sociedad civil en espacios nacionales, internacionales, para tener acceso a financiamientos de titulación en la Amazonía. Entonces es un proceso muy complicado porque no hay voluntad política y creo que eso todos lo vemos y lo vivimos y ellos son los principales impactados. Entonces nosotros consideramos eso como un pilar de que no pueden acceder fácilmente a los fondos climáticos, no pueden acceder a este financiamiento para que tengan, ¿no? Se puedan desarrollar de cierta manera, de una manera más eficiente, y es muy importante esta facilidad que puedan tener ellos y que justamente va de la mano con lo que han dicho mis compañeros, un tema de un fortalecimiento de capacidades, ¿no? Y se pueda consultar con las comunidades cuáles son los proyectos que ellos quieren que se ejecute. No, cualquier tipo de proyecto que tenga que desarrollarse en el territorio tiene que ser de la mano con las comunidades.
So building again on what my colleagues have said, one of the principal barriers for us in Peru is the lack of political will lack of political will for the government to really respond to community requirements, community needs, and community demands. The communities have had to, indigenous communities and others have had to work hand in hand with civil society organizations and really struggle to have access to finance for climate change projects because there really isn't the political will of the government to pass that money down to where it can be most effective. So for her, this is one of the primary pillars of access to climate change funds, is to build that coalition so that communities and civil society can actually work with government and demand from government that the funds come down to the communities to build capacity, to make sure that the projects actually respond to the needs and priorities of the communities.
Otra de las barreras que puedo mencionar, por ejemplo, es que en un estudio que nosotros hicimos en los últimos 10 años sobre el financiamiento, los fondos de financiamiento climático en nuestro país, de más o menos 750 comunidades que necesitaban titulación, solo se titularon alrededor de 100 en 10 años y con 10 años de fondos climáticos que tenían destinados a titulación. Es decir, solamente un 20% de comunidades tuvieron titulación de los fondos climáticos en 10 años. Entonces, es muy necesario que se haga una correcta implementación de estos fondos climáticos. Eso es otra de las barreras, ¿no? Se brindan fondos, pero en el territorio no se da de manera eficiente.
So another barrier that she wants to really highlight is that her organization has done a study about climate change funds that had as one of their goals to actually make sure that indigenous communities received land title. And it's a process of getting tenure and rights to land. Of the study, of all of the projects that they studied, and there were more than 150, only 20% actually resulted in the communities getting the land title. And this is from climate change funds. So she is really highlighting that it's important to make sure that the ends, the goals of these projects are actually implemented at the community level, and that the communities get what they need out of them. And
great. So at the Legal Empowerment Fund, one of the primary barriers that we see is that those most affected by climate change are not being invested in. So we know that Black, Indigenous, immigrant women, and people of color are the most impacted by the climate crisis, but it also means that they're the ones that are creating intersectional solutions, organizing communities, and building movements. We also think we need to democratize the language that we use in talking about climate change. Frameworks, at the national or international level should be more accessible and appeal directly to communities. And finally, we just need to listen more to the impacted communities, invest in people and traditional knowledge. The communities, they know what's good, they live with their problems day to day, and they will also live with the solutions. So at the LEF, we engage space philanthropy, and so we give our grants as long-term general operating support. We minimize the requirements for reporting, and we allow groups to follow their own strategic plans. So I'll give another example of a grantee. So the National Union of Community Forestry Development Committees in Liberia is a national group that's the umbrella organization for 23 different community forest development committees throughout the country. And they work with over 500 communities in the management of forest and land resources. And they're using this grant to strengthen their work that helps communities avail themselves of their customary land rights. So they start with communicating what the land law says. They break down the procedures that the Liberian Land Authority has developed to qualify and apply for customary land titles. And then they work directly with communities to help them form the management committees that they have to form in order to apply for their titles. They make sure that the local community forest committees are effective representatives for the communities. And then they do advocacy for changes in laws and regulations to allow communities to benefit more from their own resources. So, and the unrestricted grant, this allows the group to determine the best way to reach communities, and it ensures the sustainability of their work. And I just want to point out that there's been a disturbing trend in money given lately. We have seen that money given now is more restrictive and has more requirements. And we know that unrestricted funding is effective because it gives groups the ability to plan and operationalize a strategy and gives them flexibility to respond to emerging issues. And then they can actually sustain their work and maintain these campaigns for systemic change through advocacy or strategic litigation. So we want to make sure that long-term core support that directly supports communities affected by climate change is the type of investment that we're seeing.
Thank you very much. In my case, I think the two key barriers are companies and governments. I recall sometime this year when we had discussions with investors in Sierra Leone about the new land law that was passed in August and the inclusion of language that requires them to pay into a justice fund that communities would use to access justice when companies would misbehave. The investor's position was, why should I pay money into a fund that communities would then use to sue me? So I am not going to do that. And I think they do not want empowered communities. They want communities that are compliant, that will do as the companies please, and that will take no action when companies misbehave. And I think in that sense, they also have the backing of the government that aims to attract investment into the country and does not want to create obstacles for investors. So I would say those are the two key barriers to the kinds of investment we're looking at, that there has to be a change at that point. So for companies, the investors from outside who are putting monies into their operations need to have an understanding that it is important for communities to be empowered. Because otherwise you have a situation where when people feel that they are not being heard or being listened to, they take the law into their hands and they could disrupt your operations, they could damage your machinery, and they could basically cause all kinds of issues. So it is important that both governments and investors and companies understand that it's imperative that communities have access to justice and they have the resources to do so without the interference of themselves or third parties.
Thank you. And for our third question, again, this time we'll be starting with Gianella to give you a bit of advance warning, and we'll keep the same pattern. So I guess I'm speaking on behalf of one of the barriers, and one of the reasons I was so keen to join the panel as a facilitator today is there is a huge amount of work to do. Almost all climate finance goes into the hands of governments or international NGOs. I think there is a move among donor countries to try and address that, but it's slow. And even with we've just done the report on the first year of spending for the Indigenous People and Local Communities Finance Pledge. There was 300 million mobilised, and of that it was 7%, I think, was in direct grants. So a massive challenge for those of us holding the purse strings, I guess, to hear what's being said and to look for opportunities. I spoke with somebody yesterday who described the kind of work that all of our organisations are doing as having three phases: pioneering, delivering, and scaling. Now, you're all very much in the pioneering space, obviously, and delivering extraordinary things on the ground, extraordinary change. So the third question comes to the final phase of that, scaling, which is often the excuse, I guess, given by governments, that there are hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of grassroots communities. And that feels like a lot of small projects to be reaching out to. What type of support or organisation do we need to be able to reach that huge number of communities more effectively?
Yeah, okay. I've been requested to start again. Practically, yes, indeed. There's a lot of small projects. I think as I was speaking earlier on, I was just highlighting the number of districts or number of wards in a certain district. And to reach out to all those, it means now we have to decentralize a lot to get to those. But I think at the end of the day, in all those communities, we have areas where we know very well that these are actually mostly affected by climate change. We have certain areas where there's that need of help as a matter of urgency. So my suggestion is let's start where there's the most need as we go. But then the projects that are being implemented, or for instance, I highlighted the issues of mitigation and resilient sustainable projects. Those ones, they should be in a way that they are self-funding and also ensure sustainability. Because what we don't want is to do one thing at a certain area, come back 5 years later and start afresh. What we want is, once we do certain projects in areas, those projects are supposed to run for a long time. If ever there's need to go back, it's going back because there's need to adapt, but not because we need to start afresh. So we start where there's most need. We ensure that the projects or the initiatives that are being brought to the communities, they are sustainable for a long time. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Bueno, creo que va de la mano con lo que dijo mi compañero Effort. Es imprescindible, ¿no?, que se pueda escalar esto. Primero, se tiene que hacer una focalización de las comunidades que están siendo más impactadas, ¿no?, por el cambio climático. Me parece que esto es como vital, de que se haga una focalización con estratos, ¿no?, para poder identificar cuáles son las comunidades con mayores impactos y trabajar con ellas. De hecho, las comunidades ya vienen realizando mecanismos de adaptación de manera local, ¿no? Ellos, en el caso de Perú, las comunidades de la Amazonía vienen utilizando, por ejemplo, paneles solares para conservar su comida, para conservar los peces, para vender también sus productos. Utilizan paneles solares para las radios y para que puedan estudiar. Entonces, ya hay esfuerzos. Las comunidades, de cierta manera, vienen ya trabajando con este tema. Entonces, es necesario focalizar primero a quienes están en un estado más crítico por los impactos del cambio climático, y luego ir avanzando justamente de una manera escalada, ¿no?, y poder tratar de llegar a la mayoría, ¿no? O sea, la idea es que tengamos una visión del espacio, tanto sea geográfico, de las barreras geográficas que puedan haber, de la accesibilidad a estas comunidades y también de las necesidades. Tiene que ser la manera de organizarnos tiene que ser integral para poder identificar por dónde tenemos que actuar de manera más rápida en nuestros territorios.
So building on what my colleagues have said, it is fundamental that we focus on the communities that are most impacted by climate change. We need a process to identify which of these communities that we work with are the most impacted, and a way to support them in their adaptation. They know the best approaches to adapt to climate change. It's a question of how to support them to execute what they already know. Some of the best, some of these communities are already using approaches for adaptation, such as solar panels for refrigeration, to power radios so that their children can study, and for other things. And you really need to look at the focus on how to access some of these very remote communities, and the intersection of access issues with which communities are most impacted. You need a vision of how to really look for these communities, work with the most impacted ones, and then figure out how to scale it up from there.
Hi. So I want to talk about what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And I think that when we talk about the climate crisis, it's not really, a one-size-fits-all solution for all communities. And if we actually want to bring climate justice everywhere, we need to make sure that communities are actively engaged and mobilized. And here, the justice field is taking a relevant lesson from the healthcare field. So investors in global public health knew that if they wanted to provide healthcare for a growing global population, they couldn't just invest in training doctors. They also needed to invest in community healthcare workers to bring innovations in medicine and healthcare to remote or marginalized communities that had the most to gain. And a similar model can really work for climate justice as well. We can invest in grassroots groups that bring climate solutions to communities that have the most to gain. And I love to give examples of our grantees. So Shahidi Wamaji is a group in Tanzania that works to empower poor and disadvantaged communities on their rights to sustainable and climate resilient water resources. And they use a model similar to that of community healthcare workers. In each community, they identify local representatives as change agents, and they train them on water resource management, water rights laws and policies, and government budgeting processes. And these change agents help coordinate the implementation of water monitoring plans, and they're guided in how to meaningfully engage with decision makers at the village and district levels on water rights. And so, Shahidi Wamaji mobilizes these change agents to help communities know, use, and shape the law. So they're using legal empowerment and the community worker model to help ensure a successful implementation of a very crucial climate adaptation policy.
Thank you very much. I think what is important for us is organizing, community organizing. Now, I think about companies that go in and obtain huge parcels of land, 40, 50,000 hectares of land, and over a period of 4 to 5 years, they're able to plant oil palm across those huge amounts of land. And how do they do that? They do that by basically riding roughshod over the rights of communities. They deploy their resources and it gets done. And I think in our case, if we want to reverse that, we want to ensure that communities have a say in what happens to their land, they can also be organized. And in Sierra Leone, over the last couple of years, we have managed to organize them at the most basic level, at the village level. So you have village land committees, which comprise 30% women, who are able to make decisions about their land and their environment and what happens to their natural resources. We also have chiefdom land committees, which is a higher locality and incorporates a number of villages. I think the organizing can be done, and it must be done if we want to ensure that communities have a stake in all of this. If we make the excuse, they are so dispersed, there are so many, we can't even bring them together, I think we're just aiming for the low bar, and it's unacceptable that that would be an argument. So I would say that communities have the capacity to organize themselves, and they have been doing so in various ways, and we should work with that to ensure that they have access to these kinds of investment.
Thank you. Does anyone in the audience have any questions they'd like to pose to our fabulous panel? Peggy, are you all right to come to the bright pink cross, which I'm told is a good spot for the camera?
Okay, thank you. Oh. Yeah, Namadi has such an incredible theory of change and model that I think we need to use here in the United States. You've talked about community organizing, but I'm really interested in how you orient the the paralegals. What's the orientation, the training, to get them to understand the diversity of laws across many of the countries where you're working? Because we could definitely use a whole cohort of paralegals in many of our communities, because there are a lot of issues that are legal that wouldn't be that difficult to address, but we just don't have enough attorneys. So how do you do that orientation and recruitment?
Wonderful question. Here we go.
Thank you so much. So the paralegals we work with are not lawyers. We make it very clear because the lawyers in Sierra Leone don't like the fact that paralegals exist, or at least they didn't like the fact that they were going to exist. But over time now, they've accepted that they are an important part of the legal ecosystem. So one of the things we don't do is simply focus on giving them classroom training. It's a small bit of how we orient paralegals. I mean, at Namati, we work specifically on land rights and environmental justice. So they're trained on those specific aspects. In other countries where we work, for example, on health accountability, the paralegals are trained on laws and policies that relate to health. And so once we give them an initial training, the emphasis is on learning and doing and updating and mentoring. So they go into the communities, they do the work, they see what works well and what does not. They come back and we do updated training. They are mentored with, they're paired with other paralegals who have experience in the field. And so by doing the work on a daily basis, they get to be very, very good at it. And in fact, we have had some paralegals who have eventually become lawyers because of their love for, for the things they're doing. So I would say, to build an army of paralegals really takes time, but you don't need a university to do that. You can provide an initial basic training. We have developed, a manual for them. That is something most organizations do. They have a very specific manual and what the paralegals want to, ought to learn. But then the emphasis is on directing and helping them develop in the field as they provide services to communities. That for us has been the best orientation for the paralegals because they get to know what the communities are doing and what they want, and they can come back and align what is in the books, the laws in the books with what is happening on the ground. And I would end by saying that often we get a sense of how the law is working in practice, and that informs how we push for systemic change. Because when the paralegals go to access, for example, a regulator, an environment regulator, and try to use what is in the law books to seek remedy for communities, if it doesn't work well, they document that. And we could then use that in the future to see how we could change the processes or practices of that institution to better respond to the needs of the communities.
Great. Would anyone else from the panel like to make a short comment? No. They're all turning shy. Has anyone else in the audience got a question? I think we've got time for one more. Otherwise, I shall go ahead and take the chair's privilege. Perfect. Look. So I'm never going to be able to express the challenges you're facing as well as you do. And I'm very keen to make sure that the panelists have the last word and not the facilitator. So I'm going to ask each of you in turn. I think climate justice means different things to different people, but I hope we would all agree that part of climate justice is about providing a voice for communities, a voice for grassroots organisations, a voice for Indigenous people. And we are at the biggest annual gathering of people who make decisions and spend money on climate change. If you were able to say one thing to that group, what would it be? And before I wrap up, it would be remiss of me not to say a huge thank you to the sponsors of the pavilion. These structures are pretty expensive to set up, and they are really important for ensuring that there is a space that is owned and managed by different groups, and so that there's more diversity here than just wealthy governments. So on behalf of everyone who's been able to use the pavilion over this week and next week, a big thank you to We Act, Bellard Centre, Deep South Centre for Environmental Justice, and Legal Empowerment Network. I will also sneak in my thank you to the panelists so that I don't end up inadvertently being the last voice. And with that, a huge, huge thank you to all four of you for making the time. Over to you with your one last word for COP for everyone here who's COP. And Amy, we've not kicked off with you yet, so over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so we at the LEF, we're funding groups that use legal empowerment to fight for climate justice, because we understand that any effort to address climate change must be rooted in justice. It cannot be at the expense of people's rights. So we are asking for climate funders to decolonize their way of thinking and put resources directly into the hands of people, particularly in the global south, who know the solutions to the climate justice issues that they're facing.
Thank you. My last word would be this. In our experience, companies that are investing in traditional areas like mining and agriculture on a large scale have not respected the rights of communities. So we hope that the transition that is going to happen will not follow suit. So whether it's a solar power investment or wind investment, we still must protect and respect the rights of communities. We still must seek their consent to use their land and their natural resources. We should not take it as a given that because, oh, this is a good project, so you must say yes to it. We have to respect their rights and interests. Thank you so much.
My parting words will be climate change, or let me say the effect or magnitude of climate change is not felt the same way when you compare people who sit in offices, sit in boardrooms, conferences, or sleep in bedrooms that have temperatures that are being controlled by air conditioner, compared to communities that do not have an option at all to any of those facilities. As such, when it comes to making funds available for communities, I think it's high time that we recognize that when you talk of climate justice, there's no climate justice if there's no financing for communities that feel the magnitude of climate change the most, especially when we consider that their only crime has been to be born and live in those communities without playing a part in contributing to climate change at most.
Primero que nada, decir que las comunidades amazónicas, indígenas y las comunidades más impactadas son los agentes del cambio. Eso lo tienen que entender los gobiernos, las empresas y todos nosotros. Ellos son agentes de cambio. Cualquier proyecto, cualquier implementación que se quiera hacer con fondos climáticos del tipo que fuera, tiene que incluir las voces de las comunidades y tiene que ir de mano con ellos. Ellos son los agentes del cambio por los conocimientos ancestrales y porque además tienen maneras sostenibles de desarrollarse y de vivir. Es muy importante que esto lo entiendan las empresas, lo entiendan los gobiernos, que tienen que incluir siempre a las comunidades en cualquier proyecto que se desarrolle en territorio. Ellos son los agentes del cambio. Y por otro lado, financiamiento de una vez y ejecución para daños y pérdidas. Es urgente, está pasando. Gracias.
So with apologies that I'm interpreting the last word here, her last words were very powerful in Spanish, and I hope that I can do them some justice in English. She basically said that her last words to governments and to funders would be that there is no climate justice if funds don't actually come down to the communities, if they are not incorporated as the change agents, because they are the principal change agents. Whether they're the indigenous communities in the Amazon or communities anywhere around the world, they are the change agents. They must be part of the solution, and governments and community and governments and companies must work with them and must understand that all climate change projects must work hand in hand with indigenous communities in the Amazon, must work hand in hand with indigenous communities. They have millennia of indigenous knowledge that will make the projects more effective. And just to really emphasize.
Test, test, test.
So does this work? So again, to really emphasize that all climate change projects must work with the local change agents. And her final thoughts were that loss and damage is happening now. It's being felt across the Amazon by communities, and that must be addressed here at COP.